Last week we discussed how rural communities may develop their economies. Today we address the other open question about rural futures. How do we achieve justice between predominantly white settlers, descendants of enslaved African and African American people, and indigenous peoples on this land now called America? How do we dismantle settler colonialism and systemic racism? How do we decolonize? Don't expect easy answers, but embrace the discomfort. Some of you may want to tune out, leave, or otherwise disengage. This is understandable because for many of us, settler colonialism provides privilege, wealth, and stability. Even for those who suffer from it, settler colonialism can instill a sense of order, however wicked. Trying to undo it opens deep wounds under thin band-aids. And yet it must be done, lest our tales about justice and righteousness be hollow as the drum that accompanies them. There are several ways to approach racial justice, but today I focus on decolonization. Since American settler colonialism has been built on the theft of both indigenous land and African American labor, confronting settler colonialism sets us on the right track, although the struggles of indigenous and black peoples aren't necessarily synonymous. There are two broad lineages of anti- and decolonial work. The first one lies in the resistance of black, indigenous, peoples of colors, and otherwise colonized peoples against colonialism and racism. From the perspective of these groups, the main political project was and is liberation and the self-determination of their people. These groups resisted colonialism ever since Europeans invaded America and Africa. In the 19th century, black abolitionists like Prince Hall, Frederick Douglass, and Martin Delany wrote against colonialism and slavery as forms of anti-black oppression. Indigenous leaders such as Black Elk, Sitting Bull, Chief Joseph, or Louis Riel organized indigenous resistance against US and Canadian imperialism. Decolonization as both political and intellectual projects gained widespread attention following World War II, when the former European colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean islands declared independence. Intellectuals and activists from former colonies such as Mahatma Gandhi, Frantz Fanon, and Albert Memmi wrote against oppression and for the self-determination of colonized peoples. This in turn inspired a new wave of indigenous and black authors and activists in North America, who sought to undo racism and colonialism in the United States, such as the Black Panthers and the American Indian Movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Russell Means, or Vine Deloria Jr. The second strand of decolonial thought questions how colonization harms the colonizers. White abolitionists such as Francis Pistorius and Moses Brown considered slavery and racism a sin against Christianity, while Quakers like John Woolman or William Penn found that indigenous peoples were equals under God, and those to be treated as equals. Later, the secular norms of universal human rights, liberty, and equality compelled white and otherwise privileged thinkers to side with oppressed peoples for their own moral integrity. For example, Paulo Freire argued that oppression as a social relation stifles not only the oppressed, but also obstructs oppressors from realizing their full humanity. Erich Fromm argued that to be fully free, people need to overcome their infantile desire to dominate others. We need to recognize these two different approaches as we reflect on our own motivation to work towards social and racial justice. It makes a difference if oppressed groups struggle towards their own liberation, or if members of an oppressor group, like myself, seek decolonization because of ethical concerns or simply to pacify a guilty conscience. I now present three approaches towards racial justice between indigenous peoples, black folks, and settlers. First, let's look at reconciliation. Reconciliation describes the process by which two alienated and adversary parties come to trust one another again. Reconciliation is rooted in the Christian belief that God reconciles himself with humanity through Jesus Christ, and likewise asks the believers to reconcile among each other. It implies that people, regardless of their ascribed race, share their humanity and desire peace, if not equality, among themselves. This corresponds with the language of universal human rights as proposed by the modern liberalism of John Locke, Thomas Paine, or the United States Declaration of Independence. Reconciliation also has a psychological component, in that moral transgressions require a resolution of the cognitive dissonance between a person's noble ethical standards and a not-so-noble reality. Reconciliation as a political goal emerged in the mid-20th century. After Hitler Germany lost World War II, the Allies mandated a broad denazification and restitution program to unearth the terrors of the Holocaust, persecute the perpetrators, and reconcile German-Jewish relationships. And yet, a cloak of silence muffled the country until the post-war generation confronted their parents about their involvement in the Holocaust and the fascist regime. In post-apartheid South Africa, President Nelson Mandela established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that allowed both victims and perpetrators to express the truth about the country's racist terror and to find new ways of living together. The assumption is that truth-telling allows to forgive, and to forgive allows healing. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been credited for creating political stability and peace, but it paid the price for granting amnesty to perpetrators of human rights violations, and it could not overcome racial inequality. In North America, Canada established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to probe into the systemic abuse of Indigenous children in the country's Indian residential school system. The Commission has sparked a nationwide reckoning with settler colonial violence and anti-Indigenous racism, although critics point out that it did not address the underlying structure of settler colonialism. The German, South African, and Canadian efforts towards reconciliation are often described as attempts towards restorative justice, efforts to rebuild social trust after a period of grave human rights abuses. The second framework that I address are reparations. Reparations go beyond truth and reconciliation in that they provide a material restitution for past harm. International law calls for reparations both between international war parties and between the state and domestic victims of human rights abuses. Reparations for slavery have been discussed in America since colonial times, with the most prominent attempt being the failed 40 Acres and a Mule Special Field Orders No. 15. The United States has also paid reparations in other cases, such as for Japanese Americans interned during World War II. In our week on slavery, we talked about how slavery, redlining, and Jim Crow created a wealth gap between black and white Americans that persists until today. For that reason, calls for reparations never disappeared. Since 1989, US Representative John Conyers and Shayla Jackson Lee introduced unsuccessfully Act H.R. 40 to the House to study the merit and technicalities of reparations for slavery. In 2014, journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates published a widely discussed article in The Atlantic in which he made the case for reparations. I assigned this article for your homework. Finally, reparations have been a prominent demand of the ongoing Black Lives Matter movement. Several technicalities complicate the payment of reparations, such as identifying who should pay and who should receive the compensations, and at what level. Some proponents argue that because the legacy of slavery has been so pervasive and persistent, and systemic racism is worthy of compensation even beyond slavery, that reparations should be paid collectively by the United States to all African American people, either in the form of direct payments, through investment in predominantly black communities, or by providing privileged access to wealth-building institutions, such as colleges or subsidized mortgages. Critics within the black community warn that reparations are hush money without deep institutional reform and truth-seeking. These concerns show that paying reparations won't be easy, thus the proposed Act H.R. 40 to form a congressional commission to study the issue. Reparations are sometimes also discussed in the context of indigenous peoples. For instance, Canada paid over $3.8 billion to the survivors of its Indian residential school system. But overall, reparations cannot resolve the main point of contention for indigenous peoples, because the crime that they would redress is still ongoing: the settler occupation of indigenous land. Therefore, the main demand of indigenous peoples is not reconciliation or reparations, but decolonization. Decolonization means to repatriate land back to indigenous nations, and to fully restore their sovereignty. An unsettling thought, which is precisely the point. For settlers, whose identity and wealth hinges on the occupation of indigenous land, decolonization provokes anxiety and is almost unthinkable. Where would we go? Can we keep our property? In their landmark piece Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, which I assigned you, Tuck and Young warned that such anxieties lead settlers to reframe decolonization as something less tangible, such as a metaphor for social justice advocacy. But for indigenous peoples, decolonization means nothing less but the undoing of settler colonialism and the restoration of indigenous sovereignty over their ancestral lands. Tuck and Young admit that decolonization might be incommensurable with other progressive goals, including reconciliation, reparations, or the redistribution of wealth from capitalist elites to the non-indigenous working class. Talk about decolonization stirs uncomfortable emotions. If you feel defensive thinking this is just some radical nonsense, that colonialism is a matter of the past and you have nothing to do with it, or you just don't want to talk about it, you're not alone. If instead you're feeling an outpouring of remorse or a desire for forgiveness, you too are not alone. Indeed, our stories and histories about ourselves largely erase indigenous peoples and their contemporary claims from our consciousness. The conspiracy of silence around contemporary claims of indigenous peoples and past genocide teaches us that it is okay, even desirable, to avoid situations that cast doubt on the legitimacy of settler hegemony. This is cultural hegemony, or Luke's third dimension of power par excellence. Tuck and Young describes 6 moves to innocence that settlers used to disassociate themselves from the violence of settler colonialism, and I ask you to read that section and consider which of these moves you have used in the past. A growing body of literature also addresses the psychological defense mechanisms that settlers used to uphold a sense of ethical integrity about themselves, their communities, and their nation within a reality that begs otherwise. Denial, aggressions, avoidance, and a desire for superficial fixes are all common defense mechanisms that people use to avoid confronting troubling realities of all sorts, including settler colonialism. And yet, we have to work past these emotions to talk about our place in the world not from a position of denial, but from truth. Don't expect easy answers, but embrace the discomfort. Ta-Nehisi Coates, Eve Tuck, and Wayne Young are clear that reparations and decolonization mean to disrupt the status quo. An America in which the wealth gap between white people and people of color has been closed and indigenous sovereignty over the land has been restored will not be the America of today, and yet it might be closer to the ideals that we assert in the Declaration of Independence, in church sermons, or in political statements. A decolonized America and world will equally shake the foundations of Europe, which also has been built on the riches of colonized peoples. So I am in no way exempt from this debate, regardless of whether I'll stay in the US or return to Germany. Decolonization means to question the promises and premises of modernity, which in almost every way dominates our world. I don't know how we get out of this, and if I did, I wouldn't tell you. It is not my place to dictate a political agenda, but to raise questions and provide you with information and tools to think through these questions on your own. Good answers come from good questions, and truth comes from facing reality, however uncomfortable. And that is what rural sociology as a social science, for me, is about. To face the truth about our life on this land within all our relations. And this closes my lectures for this semester. Thank you for sticking with me, even when I introduce you to ideas that are difficult to grasp or hard to accept. As you have seen, rural sociology is a science about rural social life within an interconnected global world and environmental constraints. Some rural sociologists are predominantly concerned with questions of social justice. For others, sustainability is the major concern. And yet others use their skills to most efficiently integrate rural communities in a global capitalist economy that others ferociously resist. We don't always agree, but we do believe that open discourse based on sound empirical data helps people to make informed decisions about their actions. I ended this course with a lecture on decolonization, reparations, and reconciliation because I believe that all conversations about social life on American land are shallow unless we confront the institutions and social arrangements that make life enjoyable for some at the expense of others. We lose our credibility if we talk about justice without addressing the fundamental injustices of modernity, white patriarchal capitalism and colonialism, even if we don't always have the answers. If there's one thing that I hope you take away from this semester, it is that our present results from the actions of people who are constrained by the people around them, but that nonetheless have choices to act differently. The world can always be different, and rural folks with their boots in the mud are at the heart of it.